Let's get started. Story number 1.
Clara had never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. She had always considered herself a practical person, someone who believed in hard facts and logical explanations. But when she moved into her new apartment in the heart of the city, things began to change. The apartment was on the top floor of an old 5-story building, the kind of place that seemed charming at first glance, but as Clara settled in, she realized there were quirks about it that made her uneasy. The hallway always felt colder than the rest of the building, even in the middle of summer, and there were strange creaking sounds coming from the walls late at night. But she brushed it off. Old buildings made noises, she told herself. It was probably just the plumbing or the old floorboards settling. The first odd thing happened after her first week in the apartment. Clara had just finished unpacking, and it was late, almost midnight. She was lying in bed, reading a book, when she heard a soft tapping sound coming from the wall beside her bed. At first, she thought it might be the building's pipes, but it wasn't the rhythmic clanking that she had gotten used to. No, this was different. The tapping was deliberate, almost like a knock. She sat up in bed, listening intently. It came again, closer this time, 3 distinct knocks. She felt a shiver run down her spine. She thought maybe it was one of the neighbors knocking on the wall, but it was so late and there were no voices, no footsteps in the hall. Clara decided to investigate. She stood up, walking carefully to the wall where the sound had come from. Her heart was pounding as she pressed her ear against the cool plaster. Nothing, just silence. She backed away, feeling foolish. It was probably nothing. Over the next few days, the tapping continued, always at night, always in the same place on the wall. Clara tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the house settling or some strange noise from the building's ancient pipes. But the longer it went on, the more it unnerved her. Then, a few nights later, the tapping was joined by something else. Whispers. They started as soft murmurs, barely audible, but over time they grew louder, more distinct. Clara could hear phrases in the whispers, though they made no sense to her. It was as though someone was speaking just beyond the edge of her hearing, their words distorted and foreign. One night, after hearing the whispers again, Clara could no longer ignore it. She grabbed a flashlight and decided to explore the apartment. Maybe there was a simple explanation, a draft, perhaps, or some structural oddity in the building. She checked every corner of the room, looking for any source of the strange noises. But everything appeared normal. There was nothing out of place, yet as she stood in the middle of the room, the whispers grew louder, as though they were coming from behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. Terrified, she ran out of the apartment, down the stairs to the building's lobby. The old janitor, Mr. Ellis, was sitting in his usual spot by the door, reading a book. "Mr. Ellis," Clara asked, her voice trembling, "do you know anything about the history of this building? Has anything strange ever happened here?" Mr. Ellis looked up from his book, his weathered face softening with a smile. "Strange things? You mean the usual stuff? Strange noises, doors opening and closing by themselves?" Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" He put his book down and leaned forward. "Well, it's not a secret. The building's been here a long time. People say it's haunted. I've worked here for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things. You wouldn't believe it, but I've seen doors close and open on their own, lights flicker when no one's around. I've even heard whispers, just like you describe. It's always the top floor, the very top floor." Clara's blood ran cold. "The top floor? But why?" Mr. Ellis shrugged. "I'm not sure. People say that it's the old woman, Mrs. Greer. She lived in that apartment for years before she passed away, and well, some folks think she never left. No one knows for sure." Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. "Mrs. Greer?" she asked, almost to herself. Mr. Ellis nodded. "She was a reclusive lady. Never had many visitors. She kept to herself, mostly. But I remember she used to have a way of looking at people. Like she knew something you didn't. People always said she had a strange energy about her. When she passed, no one was really surprised, but they say she didn't leave." Clara stood there, stunned. She wasn't sure what to make of what Mr. Ellis had said. A part of her wanted to laugh it off, chalk it up to old building myths. But the other part, the part that had felt the cold, the whispers, and the tapping, knew something was wrong. The next day, Clara returned to her apartment, the events of the night before weighing heavily on her mind. She tried to shake off the fear, telling herself that it was just a coincidence, that there was a logical explanation for the noises. But as soon as she stepped into the apartment, she felt it. The air was thicker, colder, more oppressive than usual. The whispering was back, this time more insistent, almost as if it was calling her name. Clara. Her heart raced. She could hear it clearly now, the voice whispering from behind her, though no one was there. She turned around, expecting to see someone, but the apartment was empty. The whispering stopped, and the tapping began again. It was coming from the wall, louder this time. She could feel it vibrating in her bones. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her coat and ran out of the apartment again, this time heading straight for the building's old basement. Maybe she could find some clue, some explanation for the strange occurrences. The basement was dark and musty, filled with old storage boxes and forgotten belongings. Clara moved carefully through the dimly lit space, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. She walked to the far corner where a pile of old furniture was stacked. As she moved a dusty chair aside, something caught her eye, an old leather-bound book wedged between two crates. She pulled it out and blew off the dust, revealing its title, The History of the Mill Road Apartments. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the book, flipping through pages of old photographs, maps, and records. Near the back, there was a photograph of Mrs. Greer, the woman Mr. Ellis had mentioned. She looked much younger, standing proudly in front of the building. But in the background of the photo, there was something strange. An outline, barely visible at first, but as Clara stared at it, she realized it was a figure, standing just behind Mrs. Greer. A figure with hollow eyes, almost as if it were watching her. Suddenly, the temperature in the basement dropped. Clara could see her breath fogging in front of her. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around her like a storm. "Clara, leave. Now!" She turned to run, but as she did, something grabbed her wrist. It was cold, impossibly cold, like ice. Clara screamed, yanking her arm away, but whatever it was strong. The whispers grew frantic. "Leave!" With every ounce of strength she had, Clara bolted out of the basement, up the stairs, and back into the lobby. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for air. She didn't know what had happened down there, but she couldn't go back. Not ever again. The next day, Clara packed her things and left the apartment, never once looking back. She never told anyone what happened, but she knew she had encountered something beyond explanation, something she could never understand. The old Mill Road apartments were no longer a place for her, and she would never return. Story the end.
Story number 2.
Sure thing. Here's the ghost story. It started with a single photo. Emily had always loved thrift shops and estate sales. She found the picture tucked in the corner of an antique store, a faded black and white portrait of a family from the 1920s. Something about it caught her attention. The eyes of the little girl in the center seemed almost alive. They followed her, even as she shifted angles. Without hesitation, she bought the photograph for $5, thinking it would add character to her apartment. Emily hung the portrait on her living room wall. For a while, everything was normal. The days passed uneventfully, the photo a quirky addition to her decor. But then the whispers began. It was subtle at first, just a faint murmur in the middle of the night, as though someone were having a conversation in another room. Emily dismissed it as neighbors or street noise. But the whispers became louder, clearer, and soon unmistakable. "Where is she?" a small voice would ask, plaintive and weak. Emily would sit up in bed, her heart racing, straining her ears. "Who's there?" She'd call into the darkness, her voice shaking. Silence would answer her every time. One night she awoke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. They echoed through her apartment, though no one else lived there. Her throat tightened as she reached for her phone, her trembling fingers dialing her friend Leah. Leah arrived with a baseball bat in hand. "You're sure you're not imagining things?" she asked, scanning the apartment. "I swear I'm not crazy," Emily insisted. "I keep hearing voices, footsteps. It's like someone's here, but no one is." Leah spent the night on Emily's couch. By morning, she declared the place free of intruders. "See? Nothing. You've just been stressed out. Take a few days off work." Emily nodded, grateful for her friend's support, but her unease lingered. That day, While cleaning, she noticed something strange about the photo. The little girl's expression had changed. Her once neutral face now seemed to hold a faint smirk, her dark eyes glinting with something uncomfortably close to malice. Emily froze, her heart pounding. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the portrait. Holding the phone up to compare, the image in her photo remained unchanged, a simple, lifeless portrait. But when she looked back at the real thing, the smirk was unmistakable. She threw a blanket over the picture and left the apartment, spending the night at Leah's. The following evening, Emily returned home determined to get rid of the photo. But when she pulled the blanket away, the frame was empty. The photograph was gone. Panic surged through her as she frantically searched the apartment. Her walls, her shelves, her drawers, nothing. Yet, as she passed by her bathroom mirror, she caught sight of it. The photo was there, hanging behind her reflection, though it wasn't in the physical room. Emily screamed, stumbling backward. The whispering began again, louder this time, overlapping voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Her lights flickered, plunging her into moments of utter darkness before illuminating again. And then a sound, soft and chilling, laughter. The next few days were a blur of fear. Emily barely slept, jumping at every creak, every shadow. She tried to throw the frame away, even burned it, but the photograph would always reappear in its place on her wall. And each time, the little girl's smirk grew wider. One night, desperate and on edge, Emily decided to stay awake and confront whatever was happening. She sat in her living room, staring at the photo, her fists clenched. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, nothing happened. The room was silent, save for the ticking of her clock. And then the photograph changed before her eyes. The family in the picture turned their heads toward her in unison, their once vacant expressions now filled with anger. The little girl stepped forward, her black eyes glittering with hatred. "You brought us here," the child's voice hissed. Emily stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. "I didn't." "You chose me," the girl whispered, her voice cold and echoing. "You brought me home." The figure in the photograph moved closer to the glass, her small hand pressing against the inside of the frame. Emily watched in horror as the glass cracked, spiderwebbing outward. The girl's voice grew louder, shriller. "Let me out!" The room grew colder. Emily's breath fogged in the air as the lights dimmed. The girl's hand pushed harder against the glass until, with a deafening shatter, the frame exploded. Shards flew in every direction and Emily shielded her face. When she looked up, the photograph lay in tatters on the floor, but the little girl was no longer inside it. She was standing in the middle of the room. Emily froze. The child looked just as she had in the photo, her dark dress, her pale skin, her eyes like twin voids, and that smirk wider than ever. "You can't leave me," the girl said, her voice low and menacing. Emily bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She pulled at the handle, screaming, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, she heard the child's soft footsteps growing closer. When she turned, the girl was inches away. Her hand shot out, grabbing Emily's wrist with icy fingers. Pain shot through her arm and Emily's vision blurred. She felt herself being pulled, the world spinning around her. And then darkness. When Emily woke, she wasn't in her apartment. She was inside the photograph. Her reflection stared back at her, her face frozen in terror. On the other side of the glass, her living room stood empty. And there, in the center of the room, the little girl sat on the couch smiling. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The house stood at the edge of the forest, isolated and worn down by decades of neglect. It had been in my family for generations, a sprawling 2-story farmhouse that my grandparents once called home. When I inherited it, I wasn't thrilled. I lived in the city and had no plans of moving, but the house was mine now, and I decided to visit for a weekend to see if it was worth selling. I'd heard stories about the place growing up, but I never believed them. Ghosts? Whispers in the walls? My family always had a flair for drama. When I arrived, the house felt colder than the weather outside. It was early autumn, and the air carried a crisp chill, but stepping through that front door felt like walking into a refrigerator. The first thing I noticed was the silence, unnatural and heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent most of it cleaning, trying to make the place feel a little less eerie. The floors creaked with every step I took, but I convinced myself that it was just the age of the house. The pipes groaned whenever I turned on the taps, and the wind seemed to howl louder here than anywhere else, but I chalked it all up to the house settling. It wasn't until the second night that things started happening. I was in the upstairs bedroom, the one my grandparents used to sleep in. I'd found an old journal of my grandmother's while cleaning, and I'd been reading through it to learn more about her life. Most of it was mundane, notes about the weather, her garden, and my father as a child. But then, about halfway through, the tone shifted. "There's something in the house," she wrote in a hurried scrawl. "It's not just the creaks and groans of old wood. It's watching us. I hear it at night, scratching at the walls, whispering my name. James says I'm imagining things, but I know I'm not." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read. The scratching, the whispers. I hadn't heard anything like that yet. But just as I thought that, a faint noise broke the silence. It came from the hallway outside the bedroom, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking lightly on the wooden floorboards. I froze, clutching the journal to my chest, straining to hear. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept toward the door and opened it. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. I told myself it was just the house settling again, but deep down, I didn't believe that anymore. I returned to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every little sound set my nerves on edge. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves outside, the faint hum of the wind. And then, around 3 a.m., I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely more than a breath, but it grew louder, more insistent. A single word repeated over and over, "Leave." I sat up, heart pounding, scanning the room for the source of the voice. There was no one there, just me and the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the corners. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive as far away as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, maybe? Or fear? The whispers continued throughout the night, sometimes fading into near silence, other times growing so loud I thought they'd wake the neighbors, if I had any. By morning, they stopped, and I convinced myself it had been a dream, a product of my overactive imagination and lack of sleep. But the house wasn't done with me yet. The third day, I found more of my grandmother's journal entries. She described waking up to find scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the wood that hadn't been there the day before. I decided to check the house for similar marks. Sure enough, they were everywhere, long, jagged lines etched into the walls, some of them so deep they seemed to tear through the plaster. How had I not noticed them before? As night fell, the house seemed to come alive again. I heard footsteps this time, heavy and deliberate, moving through the downstairs rooms. I locked the bedroom door and sat on the bed with my phone in hand, ready to call for help, but there was no cell service out here. Of course there wasn't. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold, laughter. It was high-pitched and childlike, echoing through the house in a way that didn't make sense. It sounded close, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I shouted, "Who's there?" But the laughter only grew louder, more distorted until it didn't sound human anymore. I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, heart racing. Then the knocking began. It was violent, like someone pounding on the door with their fists. The wood rattled under the force, and I thought it would splinter. I screamed, begging whoever or whatever it was to stop, but the knocking continued. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a flashlight and praying for dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the curtains, I packed my things and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching me. It was pale and featureless, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and malevolent. I sold the house as soon as I could, not caring about the loss I took on the sale. I never went back, and I never want to know who or what lives there now. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I never believed in ghosts. I was a practical person, rooted in logic and reason. When my best friend Emma asked me to house sit for her while she went on a week-long vacation, I didn't think twice. Her family's home was old, sure, but it was charming. An 1800s Victorian with creaky floors, antique furniture, and walls that seemed to whisper their history. I saw it as an opportunity to relax, read, and escape the chaos of city life for a while. The first few nights were uneventful. The house had its quirks, random drafts of cold air, doors that didn't quite shut properly, and the occasional groan from the pipes. But nothing out of the ordinary for a house that old. I spent my evenings curled up on the sofa, flipping through books and sipping tea, with the occasional glance out the window at the dense woods that surrounded the property. It was peaceful in a way. On the third night, things changed. I was lying in bed in the guest room, scrolling through my phone when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, moving slowly across the wooden floor downstairs. My first thought was that someone had broken in. I froze, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time heading toward the staircase. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I grabbed the bedside lamp, a poor excuse for a weapon, and crept toward the bedroom door. The house was silent now, except for the faint hum of the wind outside. I slowly opened the door and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. I spent the next hour walking through the house, turning on every light and checking every lock. Nothing was out of place. No sign of anyone. I convinced myself it had been my imagination or maybe the house settling. But when I went back to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I kept myself busy, reorganizing Emma's bookshelves and binge-watching old TV shows. But as the sun set and the shadows stretched across the house, the unease returned. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, heavier, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my room. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open. And then it did. The door creaked open slowly as if pushed by an invisible hand. The hallway beyond was dark, but I could feel a presence, an overwhelming sense of being watched. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then I saw it. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, barely more than a silhouette. Its shape was human, but its edges seemed to blur and waver like smoke. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air around it felt heavy, suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering to myself that this wasn't real, that I was dreaming. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. The door was still open, but the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called Emma. I didn't want to tell her what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed to hear a familiar voice. She laughed when I mentioned the footsteps, saying her mom used to joke about the house being haunted. "It's just old," she said. "It makes weird noises sometimes. Don't worry about it." I wanted to believe her, but the next few nights proved that something was very, very wrong. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights would flicker and turn off. The temperature in the house would drop suddenly, leaving me shivering despite the heat being on. And then there were the whispers. They started as faint murmurs, barely audible, like someone speaking just out of earshot. But they grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. They always seemed to come from the next room, drawing me closer, luring me into the darkness. By the fifth night, I was unraveling. I hadn't slept in days, and my nerves were shot. I decided to set up my phone to record while I slept, or tried to sleep. I wanted proof, something to show Emma or even myself that I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, I hesitated before playing back the recording. Part of me didn't want to know what it had captured, but I had to. The audio started off with the usual creaks and groans of the house. Then, around 2 a.m., the footsteps began. They were slow and deliberate, just like I'd heard. But then came something else, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. It didn't sound human. And then, clear as day, a voice. "Get out." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. I couldn't stay here another night. I packed my things and left, leaving a hurried voicemail for Emma explaining that I'd had an emergency and had to leave early. When Emma returned, she called me, confused. "Why did you leave all the lights on?" she asked. "And why is the guest room door locked from the inside?" I didn't have an answer. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that house. I haven't been back, and I don't plan to. Emma still lives there, and she insists she's never experienced anything unusual. Maybe whatever was there didn't want her. Maybe it only wanted me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
When I first moved into the old duplex on Maple Street, it seemed like a perfect fit. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood was quiet, and the place had a certain charm. Hardwood floors, tall windows, and a clawfoot tub that I adored. It was the kind of place you'd describe as having character. My landlord, a wiry older man named Mr. Conrad, was upfront about its history. It was built in the 1920s, and over the years, it had housed countless tenants. It's seen its fair share of life, he said, laughing as he handed me the keys. I settled in quickly. The left side of the duplex was mine, while the right side was vacant. Mr. Conrad had said the last tenant had moved out abruptly, leaving behind little more than some furniture and a few dusty boxes. He assured me he'd be renovating it soon. For now, it was just me and the quiet. The first week passed without incident. I spent my evenings unpacking and exploring my new space. The old walls creaked when the wind blew and the plumbing groaned whenever I ran the water. But those were things I expected from a house this old. I even liked the quirks at first. It started with small things. I'd hear faint knocking from the other side of the duplex, always in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it might be animals, maybe raccoons or squirrels making their way inside through some unseen gap. But then I noticed the pattern. 3 knocks, always 3, spaced evenly apart like someone knocking on a door. It would stop as suddenly as it started, leaving me wide awake and staring at the ceiling. One night, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door that connected my side of the duplex to the other. It was locked, as it always was, but I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Silence. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the house settling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate steps that moved from one side of the house to the other. My bedroom was on the ground floor, and above me was the attic, a space I hadn't bothered to explore yet. My heart pounded as I lay there, listening. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I'd locked every door and window before bed. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the old house. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I decided to check the attic. Armed with a broom for protection, I climbed the narrow staircase that led up to the small door at the top. The attic was musty and dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and a stack of yellowed newspapers in one corner. I felt a rush of relief and laughed at myself for being so paranoid. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something. Scratches. They were carved into the wooden floorboards, long and jagged, as if someone had dragged their fingernails, or something sharp, across the wood. They formed no clear pattern, just chaotic, overlapping lines. My stomach churned, quickly backed out of the attic, closing the door behind me. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. I tried to ignore it, burying my head under the covers like a child, but then I heard something else. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but I was sure I heard it. Help me. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was coming from the other side of the duplex. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I even say? That I thought I heard a ghost? Instead, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, making my way to the connecting door again. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. Is someone there? No response. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I pressed my ear to the door again, and this time, I heard it more clearly. Help me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Whoever or whatever was in there, I wanted no part of it. I grabbed my keys and left the house, driving to a 24-hour diner where I sat until dawn, too scared to go back. When I finally returned, exhausted and jittery, the duplex felt different. The air inside was heavy, suffocating. I told myself I needed to get a grip, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But then I saw the door. The connecting door to the other side of the duplex was open. I froze, my keys slipping from my hand. It had been locked when I left. I was sure of it. I stepped closer, peering into the empty side. The furniture was still there, the dusty boxes untouched, but the air felt colder, like stepping into a freezer. And then I saw the mirror. It was an antique, ornate, and tarnished with age, leaning against the far wall. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to dominate the room. As I approached, I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't quite right. It moved a fraction of a second too late, like a delayed echo, and then it smiled. I didn't. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and landing hard on the floor. When I looked up, the mirror was empty. My reflection was gone. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, running back to my side of the duplex. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light on, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. The knocks came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the sound of something scratching at the door. I covered my ears, rocking back and forth, praying for it to stop. When morning finally came, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell Mr. Conrad why. I just handed him the keys and said I couldn't stay there anymore. He didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first," he said, almost apologetically. I later learned that the previous tenant, a young woman, had vanished without a trace. Her belongings were still in the house, untouched, just as I'd seen them. No one knew what happened to her. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that duplex. I've tried to rationalize it to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But sometimes late at night, I still hear it in my dreams. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was just after midnight when Vanessa's car broke down on Old Mill Road. The stretch of road was infamous among locals for being deserted and poorly lit, but Vanessa hadn't given it much thought when she took the shortcut home. She cursed under her breath, trying her best to stay calm as her car sputtered and came to a dead stop. She reached for her phone only to realize there was no signal. "Of course," she muttered, glancing at the empty road ahead. The woods on either side were dark and dense, their silhouettes leaning in as if they were listening. A faint mist crept along the ground, curling around her tires. She debated waiting for someone to drive by, but knew it could be hours before another car passed through. Gathering her courage, Vanessa grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into the cold night air. She opened the hood, the flashlight's beam slicing through the mist. Steam rose from the engine, and while she wasn't an expert, she could tell something was seriously wrong. A low, rustling noise came from the trees nearby, and she froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Probably just an animal," she whispered to herself, though her pulse quickened. She decided to walk back to the last house she'd passed. It wasn't far, maybe a mile, and sitting alone in the dark car didn't feel like a better option. Pulling her jacket tighter around herself, Vanessa started down the road, the beam of her flashlight wobbling with each step. The night was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of her boots on the gravel. The further she walked, the more oppressive the silence became, as if the woods were holding their breath. She thought of stories she'd heard about this road, rumors of accidents, strange disappearances, and ghostly sightings. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. "Just superstitions," she muttered. Then she saw it. A light up ahead, faint and golden. Relief washed over her as she realized it must be the house she was looking for. As she got closer, she noticed the house was older than she remembered, its wooden siding warped and peeling. The front porch sagged under the weight of years, and the single light in the window flickered like a candle. Vanessa hesitated. Something about the house felt wrong, but the chill biting through her jacket reminded her she couldn't afford to be picky. She stepped up onto the porch, the boards creaking underfoot. Lifting her hand, she knocked on the door. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house were hollow. She waited, but no one answered. She knocked again, louder this time. A faint shuffle came from inside, followed by the soft creak of floorboards. Vanessa leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Hello? I'm sorry to bother you, but my car broke down. Can I use your phone?" The door creaked open just an inch, revealing a dark interior. She peered inside, squinting against the shadows. "Hello?" she called again, but no voice answered. After a moment's hesitation, she pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The air was heavy and smelled faintly of damp wood and mildew. The room she entered was sparsely furnished, an old sofa, a dusty coffee table, and a fireplace filled with cold ash. A single candle burned on the mantel, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and stretch unnaturally. "Is anyone here?" Vanessa asked, her voice echoing slightly. She turned toward the staircase at the back of the room. Footsteps creaked above her, slow and deliberate. She felt a chill run down her spine. "I just need to use the phone," she said, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. Vanessa's hand tightened around the flashlight as she debated leaving. But then she saw it, a phone, an old rotary model, sitting on a small table in the corner. She hurried over and lifted the receiver to her ear, but there was no dial tone, just static. "Great," she muttered, slamming the receiver back down. A loud thud came from upstairs, as though something heavy had fallen. She spun toward the staircase, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "Hello? Are you okay?" There was no response, but the air grew colder, and Vanessa's breath fogged in front of her. She backed toward the door, every instinct telling her to leave. But before she could turn, she heard the soft sound of a child giggling. It was faint, almost melodic, and it sent a wave of unease through her. She turned back toward the room, the beam of her flashlight darting around. "Who's there?" she demanded. The giggle came again, this time from the far corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. Vanessa's heart pounded as she stepped closer, the light revealing an old wooden rocking chair. It moved gently, back and forth, though there was no one in it. She stumbled back, her mind racing. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This isn't happening." The sound of footsteps resumed, but this time they were descending the stairs. Each step was slow and deliberate, the wood groaning under the weight. Vanessa turned toward the staircase, the flashlight shaking in her hands. She saw a figure at the top of the stairs, a woman in a long, tattered dress. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her head was tilted unnaturally to the side, as though her neck had been broken. "Get out," the woman rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the door, her heart slamming against her ribs. But as she reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. She yanked and twisted, panic clawing at her throat. Behind her, the sound of the woman's footsteps quickened, the heavy thud of her boots closing in. Vanessa turned, pressing her back against the door. The figure was halfway down the stairs now, her head lolling with each step. "You shouldn't have come," the woman hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. Vanessa screamed and threw her weight against the door. It burst open, and she stumbled out onto the porch, nearly falling down the steps. She didn't stop running until she was back on the road, her lungs burning and her legs trembling. She glanced back once, and the house stood dark and silent, as though it had never been lit at all. By the time Vanessa flagged down a passing car, she was too shaken to explain what had happened. The driver, an older man, listened patiently as she stammered out bits and pieces of her story. When she mentioned the house, his expression darkened. "That old place?" he said, shaking his head. "It's been abandoned for years. No one's lived there since the fire." Vanessa frowned. "Fire?" "Back in the 1950s, the man said. Family died in their sleep. People say the house is cursed, that the spirits of the family still linger. But it's just stories." He gave her a sidelong glance. "You must have been seeing things." Vanessa didn't argue. She knew what she had seen, what she had felt. And as the car drove her away from Old Mill Road, she swore she could still hear the faint sound of a rocking chair creaking in the distance. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the winter of 2016 when I moved into the apartment. It wasn't anything special, a small one-bedroom unit in an old brick building on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where the radiators clanged in protest and the windows let in drafts no matter how many times you tried to seal them. But it was affordable, and after a rough breakup, I needed a fresh start. The landlord, Mrs. Latham, was an elderly woman who lived on the first floor. She handed me the keys with a smile and a warning. "The building's old, you know," she said. "It makes noise. Don't let it spook you." At the time, I brushed it off as part of the building's charm. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or hauntings. But looking back, I realized Mrs. Latham's words carried a weight I didn't understand at the time. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, rearranging furniture, and trying to make the place feel like home. The only odd thing was the closet in the bedroom. It was small, with a wooden door that didn't quite fit the frame. No matter how hard I tried to shut it, it would always creak open just an inch or two. I figured it was the uneven floorboards and let it go. The first incident happened on my fourth night there. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The wind outside howled, rattling the old windows. As I pulled the blanket tighter around me, I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was coming from inside the apartment. It was so quiet I could barely make it out, but it sounded like someone saying my name. Anna. I froze, my heart pounding. I strained to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of my exhausted mind. But the unease lingered. The next day, I went about my business, trying to ignore what had happened. But that night, as I lay in bed, the whispering returned. This time it was louder, clearer. Anna. The voice was soft, almost pleading. It sent chills down my spine. I sat up, my eyes darting around the room. The whisper seemed to come from the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just as it always was, and the darkness inside felt deeper, heavier. I stared at it, waiting for something to happen, but the room was silent. The next morning, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I opened the closet door wide. It was empty, just a small space with a metal rod for hanging clothes and a few scuff marks on the floor. But as I stood there, I felt it, a cold draft, like the air was being pulled into the closet from somewhere deeper. I ran my hand along the back wall and felt a small gap. Curious, I pressed against it, and to my surprise, the panel moved. Behind the wall was a narrow passageway, no more than 3 feet wide, leading into darkness. The air was damp and smelled of earth and decay. My stomach churned, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside, using my flashlight to guide the way. The passage didn't go far, maybe 20 feet, before it ended abruptly in a small circular room. The walls were lined with old bricks, and the floor was dirt. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, rotted and broken. Surrounding it were strange markings etched into the dirt, symbols I didn't recognize. I felt a wave of nausea and stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The air seemed heavier here, suffocating. I turned and hurried back to the apartment, slamming the closet door shut behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just an old storage space, something forgotten by time, but the unease in my chest wouldn't fade. That night, I was woken by the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my bedroom door. My breath hitched as I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. Then I heard the whisper again, "Anna." The voice was right next to me, as if someone was standing by my bed. I screamed and turned on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. The closet door, however, was wide open. The days that followed were worse. Lights flickered on and off. Objects moved on their own. A glass of water tipped over on the counter. My keys appeared in a different spot than where I'd left them. And always, the whispering. It followed me everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. I felt like I was losing my mind. I decided to talk to Mrs. Latham. She seemed hesitant at first, but when I mentioned the closet and the passageway, her face went pale. She admitted that the building had a dark history. Decades ago, a tenant had disappeared, an artist who lived alone. The police searched the building but found no trace of her. Mrs. Latham lowered her voice and said some of the older residents believed the building was cursed, that the artist's spirit never left. That night, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bags, planning to stay with a friend until I could find a new place. But as I was leaving, I heard it again. The whisper, louder than ever, coming from the closet. "Anna." Against my better judgment, I opened the door one last time. The passageway was there, but this time something was different. At the end of the dark tunnel in the circular room, a faint light glowed. It flickered like a candle, casting long, eerie shadows. And in the chair, I saw her, a figure slumped forward, her hair hanging over her face. I stumbled back, slamming the closet door shut and running out of the apartment. I didn't stop until I was in my car, driving away as fast as I could. I never went back. I left my things, my deposit, everything. Mrs. Latham called me a week later asking if I'd forgotten to return the keys, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. I still dream about that apartment sometimes. In my dreams, I'm standing in the circular room staring at the chair, and every time the figure lifts her head and looks at me with hollow eyes. Story the end.
Story number 8.
When my grandparents passed away, the family decided to sell their house. It was an old, creaky place that had been in the family for generations. No one wanted to live there anymore. It was too far from the city, too big for any of us, and filled with too many memories. Since I had just finished college and was between jobs, my parents asked me to stay there for a week to clean it out before the sale. I agreed, thinking it would be an easy task. Pack some boxes, toss out old junk, and maybe reminisce a little. But I hadn't been back to the house since I was a kid, and walking through the door for the first time in over a decade, I was struck by how small it felt. As a child, it had seemed massive, almost castle-like, with its winding staircase and dimly lit hallways. Now it just felt heavy. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time sorting through piles of old photo albums, newspapers, and forgotten knickknacks. The house was eerily quiet, but I chalked that up to its location, miles away from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense woods. Occasionally, I'd hear the house groan as the wind pressed against it, or the faint sound of birds outside, but nothing unusual. Then, on the third night, I heard it. I was lying in bed in one of the upstairs rooms, scrolling through my phone. It was late, probably past midnight, and the house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Just as I was about to turn off the light, I heard footsteps in the hallway. At first, I froze, thinking maybe it was just the house settling. But these weren't random creaks or groans. They were deliberate, measured steps, moving slowly toward my room. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened as the sound grew closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stared at the door, half expecting it to open, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and check the hallway. It was empty. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the old house had played a trick on me. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. That night, I decided to sleep with the door open. I thought maybe it would make me feel less isolated, less trapped. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint whispers. They were coming from downstairs, soft and indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. I grabbed the flashlight I'd been keeping by my bed and crept down the staircase. As I descended, the whispers grew louder, but I still couldn't make out the words. They seemed to be coming from the living room. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving the house in an oppressive silence. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but everything was as I'd left it. Just as I was about to turn around and head back upstairs, I noticed something strange. The old rocking chair in the corner, my grandmother's favorite, was gently swaying back and forth. I stared at it, frozen in place, as the motion gradually slowed to a stop. The next morning, I called my mom to tell her what had happened. She listened patiently but laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or my overactive imagination. "That house is full of memories," she said. "It's bound to play tricks on you." But I wasn't so sure. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Doors would open and close on their own. I'd hear muffled voices coming from empty rooms. The air in the house grew colder, no matter how high I turned up the heat. And then there was the smell, a faint but unmistakable scent of flowers like lilies that would waft through the air at random times. On the fifth night, I had the most terrifying experience yet. I woke up to the sound of my name being whispered, softly at first, then louder, more insistent. "Megan," the voice called. It sounded like my grandmother, but warped, distorted, as if it were coming from underwater. Terrified, I pulled the covers over my head, hoping it would stop. But then I felt it, a hand, ice cold, pressing down on my shoulder. I screamed and bolted out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. When the room flooded with light, I was alone. But the closet door, which I always kept closed, was wide open. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with every light in the house turned on. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and called my parents, telling them I couldn't stay there another night. They were annoyed but agreed to hire someone else to finish the job. I left that house and never went back. It sold a few months later, and I've heard nothing from the new owners. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that week. I think about the whispers, the footsteps, and the cold hand on my shoulder, and I wonder if the house ever truly let go of the past, or if it's still holding on to something, or someone, that doesn't want to leave. Story the end.